Hello, it's great to be back with you. I'm Alex Aronson from Court Accountability Action here with my intrepid co-founder and partner, the great Lisa Graves. Thrilled to be back here on Legal AF. We're going to dig into some stuff we've talked about before, but getting a little deeper in the weeds on what we think is one of the biggest threats to be prepared for in a coming Trump administration and what we can do now to make sure Congress does everything in its power to foreclose this threat to try to forestall it. That is this threat of impoundment being sort of offered by Elon Musk, Vivek Ramaswamy, Russell Vogt, who has been named as the likely incoming director of the very important Office of Management and Budget. And impoundment is the idea that the president can impound or refuse to spend funds that Congress has authorized and appropriated. In their Wall Street Journal op-ed, Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk described their plans to use this very controversial impoundment power. It's sort of an invented constitutional power that they think they are likely to prevail upon if they make this maneuver to sort of refuse to spend this money from Congress. They think they'll prevail at the Supreme Court. They might well, but we wanted to dig into some of the constitutional questions raised by impoundment, some of the implications of what it would mean for a president to be able to impound congressionally authorized funds, and some of the background on the characters and individuals who have been pursuing this theory. Lisa, you want to kick us off?
Yeah. So this is a thing that people learn about in high school and college about like what are the powers of these different branches of government. And the Constitution in Article 1 expressly gives Congress the constitutional power to raise money and decide how to spend it. If you want to look it up, it's in Article 1 of the Constitution, Section 7, Section 9. And so the essence is that it's not the president who controls the power of the purse, it's Congress. The job of the president in Article 2, which is the executive branch, is to execute the laws and decisions made by Congress. And so under those powers, agencies, can't spend money that Congress hasn't appropriated to them. And traditionally, over decades and decades and decades, the executive branch can't refuse to execute Congress's decisions by impounding, meaning, refusing to spend those funds or spending them elsewhere. Trump tried this the first time around a couple times. One was redirecting money to building the wall that he claimed Mexico was going to pay for. But the other part that I think people, probably didn't catch in the midst of everything else going on was that one of the charges in the first impeachment trial of Donald Trump after he was impeached by the House of Representatives was that he withheld money that Congress had allocated for security in Ukraine after the invasion or the efforts by Putin to basically take over parts of Ukraine. What happened was Trump tried to use that money basically to try to coerce Ukraine into probing Joe Biden. So you had in the aftermath of that a report by the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, that's found that Trump's actions violated the Impoundment Control Act. The Impoundment Control Act was an act that had to be passed by Congress after Nixon's machinations to try to make sure that executive branch officers, the president or his henchmen, don't basically redirect money that Congress allocates to something that they didn't allocate the money to. So that's a bit of a sort of a technical description, but a current context description of what that power involves. So
I think we're going to need to be sort of in the weeds on some of these threats that start to present themselves through this next Trump era, because so much of it has been outsourced to the legal apparatus, right? And it's part of the trick, right? This is not the stuff the press wants to cover. It's not the stuff that people naturally are drawn to in terms of headlines, but it is how they are. These are the levers through which they are going to do the damage. And and President Trump, hate to call him that, but that's what he's going to be very shortly. Has been, as you mentioned, Lisa, agitating around this impoundment power for some time now. He invoked during campaign season. It was June or July when he was talking about impoundment. Obviously, Donald Trump is sitting around, reading constitutional history and law, is deeply versed in impoundment, in constitutional theory. So we know that it comes from a really grounded and solid place. But, it's actually, when we saw Trump starting to talk about impoundment in the summer, it was a very clear sign that he was, working with these right-wing legal movement lawyers and a lot of the Project 2025 architects like Russell Vought. And hopefully we can stop him from getting confirmed, but we should talk about that later because I think it's going to be one of the highest orders of business in terms of Senate-focused nominations advocacy as we head into the new year, trying to stop that particular nomination. Vought is a self-declared Christian nationalist. He believes in a radical constitutionalism. Those are his words. He thinks we are living in a post-constitutional time. His organization, in a paper authored by none other than Mark Paoletta, the henchman, friend, defender of Clarence Thomas, who appears in that famous photo of Harlan Crow and Thomas and Leonard Leo at Camp Topridge enjoying themselves. He writes this piece. He writes this sort of, very detailed legal analysis claiming a constitutional power of impoundment, going back through history, sort of cherry picking his history, looking at precedent. And there are examples of presidents who have refused or declined to spend money that Congress has authorized. And in some circumstances, it seems very clearly okay, right? It tends to be in situations where Congress has used language that is permissive of that sort of discretionary decision making about not spending the money. But Paoletta argues that the congressional power of the purse, its most fundamental power, provides only a ceiling on presidential expenditures and not a floor. But that's just unsupported by law, precedent, and history. When Congress passes an appropriations law, that is a law like any other law. And as you mentioned, Lisa, Article 2 of the Constitution provides that the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. So if Congress passes an appropriations law that funds certain programs, and federal programs affect all manner of our lives, right? Every issue under the sun. If the president were able to, at his discretion, decide not to spend money that Congress had appropriated, he would be stealing that power away from Congress and therefore thereby the people, and again, sort of consolidating power into what is increasingly looking like a monarchical unitary executive power. So very dangerous and completely unsupported by precedent and history. In every instance where there has been sort of mandatory language, except the example you mentioned, which was Richard Nixon saying, no, I'm just not going to spend this money. I disagree with what Congress has done. The president has gone along with what Congress has ordered the president to do in terms of this federal spending. And when Nixon did that, as you mentioned, Lisa, Congress very swiftly and in a bipartisan fashion condemned that and passed the Impoundment Control Act, which I think will be the nub of the conflict when Musk, Trump, Vought, through this consolidation of executive power, try to start overstepping their executive power. And we have challenges to those maneuvers that could very well reach the Supreme Court.
Well, that's right. When you sort of step back from the things that Trump was saying this summer, when he basically said he was going to just use impoundment, like assert that he has a constitutional authority to spend money however he wishes, notwithstanding the statute and prior precedents. That assertion was made in part because he was simultaneously lying about not having anything to do with Project 2025 or the people involved in Project 2025. He was obsessed with basically lying to the American people, saying, oh, I don't know anything about this. It's not me. While the claims that were coming out of his campaign, particularly on impoundment, were fully aligned with the claims within Project 2025 and within, as you mentioned, the work of Russell Vought, who was his head of the Office of Management and Budget in his first term. And the counsel to Russell Vought in that first term was Mark Paoletta. So this is their playbook. This is the playbook they tried to run before. This is the playbook they're going to try to run on steroids with the help of Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. And this is a playbook that is profoundly in contradiction to our actual statutes, the law that governs how money is spent, and contrary to precedents about when Congress makes a specific allocation. And so this is very dangerous. If you think about it in a broader sense, it's that this idea that a president can do no wrong, which is what John Roberts and his Republican appointees to the court, created in that immunity decision, then to compound that with this idea that the president can unilaterally spend whatever money Congress gives in all sorts of ways that Congress did not intend, did not allocate for. It's the recipe for tyranny. It's autocracy. It's authoritarian rule. It's basically investing in one man and his henchmen, his willing henchmen, the power to basically rewrite American law, American policy without Congress. And in this context, you have a president or a president-to-be, who has a Senate majority and a very narrow House majority. And they don't even trust Congress to play any role in this process. Basically, they want to unilaterally dictate, as in be a dictator about what programs Americans rely on get funded and which ones they don't, because they don't like them or they don't like the policy. That's not how America works. That's not how we're supposed to work as a democracy. The president isn't the supreme power, not the supreme commander, not the supreme leader of the United States. He is a president whose job is to execute the laws passed by Congress. We may disagree with some of those laws, but that's a check and balance. That's part of our constitutional system. And that's what Donald Trump and his henchmen are trying to undo, the very idea of checks and balances.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up and mentioned Congress and the thin majority that Republicans will have when the new year flips, because this is going to be an essential area for public advocacy. The founders, when they created the system of checks and balances, and when they drafted the Constitution, they weren't like so worried about partisan squabbles, right? Because they believed that we would have institutional allegiance, that elected officials would have institutional commitments, right? Members of Congress would defend congressional prerogatives, the court would defend judicial prerogatives, and the president would defend executive prerogatives. And I think one of the dangers that we face as we enter this red trifecta, and as we have lived through in this last MAGA era, has been that sort of institutional competition, that inter-branch competition, has really gone by the wayside in favor of partisan polarization and party competition. And with Republicans in control of all three branches, what I fear could materialize is that Republicans in Congress, MAGA Republicans in Congress, will willingly give away congressional power in the service of this dictatorial agenda, the one that you just walked us through. But at the end of the day, that majority is slim. At least for now, these members of Congress still need to seek re-election, particularly in the House. They have to seek re-election every 2 years. And the vital services and quality of life that we depend on from a functioning federal government have to be their responsibility. And so I think, constituents, voters, advocates need to make clear to Democratic and Republican members of Congress alike that this assertion of executive power, right, this seizure of congressional power to wield the purse strings, is unacceptable, and that it will be met with rejection at the ballot box. I think Democrats, particularly in the Senate, where they still have majority for a couple more months here, and where the appropriations process is, still very much underway, right? There was a short-term appropriations deal that lasts until December 20th, and they will need to come up with either another stopgap or a longer-term appropriations deal to fund the government into 2025. I don't think, as destructive as the Republicans are, that they will want a government shutdown right as Trump assumes the presidency. The Democrats in Congress need to make very clear in any appropriations language that they agree to, that any appropriations that they make are not permissive, that they are mandatory, such that Trump, if he does try to pull this maneuver, will have as much in the way of obstacles as possible. So I think this is somewhere, of course, like, we're used to sort of advocating on economic issues, on social issues with our members of Congress. There's not a ton of appropriations focused advocacy from outside sort of elite and specialized advocacy communities. But this is something for all of us to make our voices heard about, send a very clear message to our members of Congress that, they need to be mindful of this impoundment threat, and they need to be thinking about it when they vote on these appropriations bills coming.
Yeah, that's right. And, when you look at the race that just happened, the November election, despite the claims of a mandate or an overwhelming, mandate for this extremism, that's actually not the case. There are literally dozens of House seats that are separated by 2% or 1%, 2%, 3% of the vote. And so you have a number of people who are in office, Republicans and Democrats, who are there by a very small portion of the electorate. And this program that Trump is planning to try to impose is so radical, so reactionary, and so destructive. I think that it's going to be very important for people to be calling the district offices, your local district offices, whether you have a Republican representative or a Democratic representative, and telling them that you expect them to protect these federal programs from being attacked and undermined by these two billionaire bros, Vivek and Elon, working with Trump to basically disrupt the programs that Americans rely on. And the other thing you mentioned, Alex, was this idea that the founders expected Congress to defend its power of the purse. I mean, it's not ambiguous. Congress has the power of the budget. There's nothing, gray about it. It's an explicit grant of power. And yet, just to go back to one of our earlier conversations, you have people who are deferring to the notion that someone like Leonard Leo supports the so-called rule of law, when these sorts of claims are being made. And Mark Paoletta, as you mentioned, has worked closely with Leonard Leo to buttress Clarence Thomas, to try to burnish Thomas's reputation, despite how corrupt, in my view, Clarence Thomas is. But you have this situation in which there's a person who has helped install these members of the Supreme Court, and yet the group that he co-chairs, the Federalist Society, seems to have no regard for the actual Federalist Papers. For example, Federalist Number 10, which express deep concerns about factions, about the idea that factions would come to dominate U.S. government, and it was important to guard against those factions because they fundamentally assault liberty. The ability of a faction like a MAGA faction to basically come together in a unified way to ignore the Constitution, to ignore the commands. I think we saw that already in the second impeachment, if not the first, where you had Republicans who were unwilling to enforce the rule of law against a president who incited a mob to attack the Capitol to stop that vote. But this faction, if you had a so-called Federalist Society that actually abided by the rhetoric of its name, you would have a group like that objecting to a president behaving in this way, objecting to the notion that these non-federal employees, non-appointees, these two guys, Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk, have some role in our government who are not elected, not appointed, not employed, not subject to any of the ethical rules that apply to conflicts of interest or anything, at least from what we can see. You would have a group, a so-called conservatives, wishing to conserve the Constitution and its powers, objecting, but you don't, because the Federal Society and under Leonard Leo's helm is in service of the power that Leonard Leo wants to exert. And as you mentioned, his groups, the groups that he's closely tied to, that he's helped fuel this Project 2025 agenda, this extreme agenda. And we have a lot of work cut out for us, for you, to really help defend our rights, to defend the programs that people rely upon from this unified assault, or this effort to have a unified assault on these basic federal programs. And they're not just programs like in some bureaucratic sense. These are the things that help make actually make America great, to have good funding for our public schools, to have water that's clean, to have cleaner air versus, air that's spoiled by pollution run wild. We can go on and on about it, and maybe we will at some point, but that's the sort of thing that Alex and I have been working on, is how can we make sure we are protecting those fundamental rights, and also protecting against and basically making sure people understand the court's role as an accessory in some of this, but also to not feel like we're powerless. We have the power to change things together if we don't give up, if we don't give in to despair. So yeah, thank you so much, Alex. Seriously.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Lisa. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. It is a pleasure a pleasure as always to be with you here on Court Accountability Meets Legal AF. Until next time, have a great day and enjoy that Thanksgiving leftover feast.
Thank you.
In collaboration with the Midas Touch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel where I'll be curating the top stories at the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.